Hi, welcome back to the Indie Wine Podcast. This episode is number 5. Recently sat down with Craig Haarmeyer of Haarmeyer Wine Cellars to hear his thoughts on Chenin Blanc, climate change, working in the Clarksburg AVA, Helles Chenin, and some of the history of the Harbor Winery. A native of Sacramento, Craig works out of the Harbor Winery building, which still contains some remembrances of its longtime tenant, Charles Myers and Harbor Winery, including labels on the walls and a poster of the famous David Lanscoyne's label of the 1988 Amador Zin, and some of the old crushers and distemmers and dairy tanks for fermentation. We talked outside at some tables behind the winery amongst a giant orange tree, and some older seedless muscat, and some mission vines growing on the arbor, and the previously mentioned tanks and equipment. Craig and his family's roots run real deep in the Sacramento food and wine scene, and I hope you enjoy listening to this interview. Oh, and one other thing. Around the 8-minute, 50-second mark, we had a AC unit compressor kick on behind the winery here. I left part of the moment in, just for context, but it will only last about 5 seconds. Just giving you a warning so it's not too big of a surprise. Thanks. Here we go.
This is a Sunday here, so the yard is not, although it was kind of cool to get some of the background noises in here. That's one of my favorite things about this spot is it's so industrial. And here we get the trucks moving about and hitting the curb and the diesel motors running, and it's kind of peaceful.
How'd you get started in the wine business?
I would say pretty much by accident. My dad was a developer here in town, and he built and rebuilt and restored several buildings in what's known as Old Sacramento now, which when I was a kid was Skid Row.
Mm-hmm.
And he was an attorney, and he had a client who didn't have money to pay him, but he had all deeds to properties in this old part of town. And my dad, saw that the state of California was planning to open a railroad museum. So seeing the potential for tourism, he formed a partnership, of local business people and judges and attorneys and doctors and lawyers, and they proceeded to restore and build from scratch to historical accuracy several buildings in Old Sac. It was slow economically, and I think people didn't really understand that part of town at that time. And so they had trouble finding tenants, and so when they couldn't find a tenant, what they would do was create one. And that's where my mom came in, and she was a cook. I wouldn't say a chef, although her interest in cooking was of a higher level than just your average housewife, I would say. And so she moved on to conceive of, develop, and open these various different restaurants in Old Sacramento. And that was when I was in my youth. And when I was about 14, I started working for them in one of their restaurants in the dish pit. Worked my way up to the kitchen. So I was a line cook for several years for them. And around that time, they also had a wine bar above one of the restaurants. And that was in the late 70s when, California was just being recognized in a real way for winemaking. So basically, I've just been immersed in food and wine all of my life from a very early age. And even though I did quite a bit of raiding of my parents' liquor cabinet and cellar for things we would very irresponsibly drink as youths, I was also very much paying attention to the way that these things tasted.
Okay.
And so I've been a bit of a maybe higher than average critic, at least in my consumption of these things. So I don't know when I actually started. I moved, and one of the main things I learned from my parents is never go into the restaurant business, because that was just I admire what they did, but it seemed very difficult. Did not work out very well for them. Restaurant business, you can ask anybody in that business, they'll tell you it's not for the faint of heart.
Mm-hmm.
And so I also learned early on that I never wanted to be in the restaurant business, although that's pretty much how I paid my way through college and all that when I moved to go to art school in San Francisco. I always wanted to make wine, but I never thought it was possible being raised in a very suburban kind of area, raised in that manner. I just always figured that winemakers are people who are born into it, families that have estates, or at least to farming families, if not winery families. And so I just never really, it never entered my thought as something that I could do myself. So I started brewing because I love fermented things, and we make pickles and we make kimchi and I love fermented foods
Mm-hmm.
as well as fermented beverages. And so when I was in college and living in an apartment, I wanted to make beer, which I did, and to some success. And I was very popular with my friends, and they all thought that it
Can
was very
imagine.
good. And this kind of was around the time when the first prohibition on brew pubs was lifted in the mid 80s. And so I spent a time when I was in San Francisco going to a lot of those new establishments and trying those things, and very interested. And so I did that on a very small scale at home. And then I went to grad school, and like one of my instructors in grad school was a home winemaker, but a home winemaker on a very large scale. So I saw that. And then where we are now at Harbor Winery, those are family friends as well. And so when I moved back to Sacramento and started going to graduate school, you know, my enthusiasm and interest in this sort of thing led me to help them out during harvest in the 90s. So right here where we've landed is where I first saw commercial winemaking. I was a little surprised at, coming from more of a brewing perspective, I really appreciated how the microbiome of the cellar and the vineyard, in other words, engineering things and cleanliness are not necessarily the hallmark of winemaking. Brewing
Mm-hmm.
is totally different. You know, you don't have natural acidity to protect the beer. You can't add any sulfur. It's just a totally different thing, whereas wine is just much more feral, and you get what you get sometimes, and sometimes it's magnificent and sometimes it's not. And I just like that canvas, so to speak, much more so than other fermented beverages. Distilling is on the other end, another subject. I've never done that. I'm not sure I want to do that.
And that was Charlie Myers at
And that
Harbor
was
Winery
Charlie
that you're
Myers here,
working with?
yeah, at Harbor Winery. You know, and we were not necessarily friends. I'm friends with his kids, and so it's not like I had an intimate relationship with him, but I was here when it was happening. But I was able to glean enough from the operation. I'm a quick learner, or so I'm told. Seeing his process here was enlightening for me. And however, you know, we had small children and I had another career. So I still was not thinking about any major career change at that time. But that came a bit later when my career became just kind of untenable for me.
You started as an artist, right?
Well, I started as an artist, yeah. So I'm a trained painter. I have a master's degree in studio painting and sculpture. And, you know, I kind of fell into that just because it's all I had. I had no other direction when I was younger. And so I did that. And I built that to a certain degree. I had gallery shows and, you know, but at the end of the day, it just was not really what's needed to raise a family and pay a mortgage and all that stuff. And so the job that I took when I was in grad school, I built into something else. So I basically ended up creating a job for myself as the director of a labor union, their IT infrastructure. So if I couldn't paint, at least I could be creative. At least this is what I told myself,
Mhm.
that I could be creative building networks and firewalls and databases, and that sustained me
Yeah.
for 10 years or so and made
Okay.
me quite a bit of money and definitely put our family in a good position financially. So I can't say that I regret that experience. However, when that kind of self-destructed is when I decided to take a year off and help a friend who had started a winery, because that was about the time when Charles here at Harbor he made his last vintage, and I didn't have any place to go during harvest. And so a
Hmm.
elementary school, high school friend of mine started a winery in downtown Sacramento. And I thought, oh, perfect. This is a place for me to,
Yeah. New spot to go.
it's a good spot to help out. And one thing led to another, and they were going to close the business because they had some real struggles early on. They didn't have a winemaker, and so they basically said, "We're going to close the doors unless you would take a chance and make wine for us." And so that's what I did, and that was a nice break for me from the IT field. Gave me room to decompress and be creative and do something. And it was about then that I really realized that probably food and beverage and hospitality is really more suited for me. I took a kind of circuitous route to get there, but I probably should have been doing that from day one. But we all make mistakes and learn, and hopefully we're learning.
What were you able to take from your experience being a winemaker for others to then start your own winery?
That's a good question, because usually early on in a winemaker's career, they're not dealing with custom crush clients or other people. And my first job at the winery was to try and salvage a horribly smoke-tainted, ruined vintage. I just very early on was tasked with managing many different kind of ticklish situations. And so custom crushing for people really, I think, I learned a lot about myself and my ability to talk to people and figure out what it is they want and to try and give them what they want. It was just a totally different kind of thing for me early on.
What year did you start Haarmeyer?
Well, Haarmeyer Wine Cellars is the business name for the LLC, which was formed in 2016. But we started with our Santre label in 2008, and we were doing that at Revolution. And it was actually a Revolution. It was owned by Revolution. I was a partner in Revolution Wines,
Okay.
so that actually was one of their brands, one of their labels. So Revolution financed all that. They collected all of the revenue. I was just the creative force behind it.
Mm-hmm.
So when that partnership dissolved, I just continued, and we officially named it Haarmeyer Wine Cellars in 2016.
2016. Okay. Did you move into the Harbor Winery here in 2016 also?
Exactly. Yep. That same year.
I read somewhere that you originally started with more Iberian varieties. What drew you to those, and then what has kind of changed to make you concentrate more on Chenin's and Nebbiolo?
Couple things. Early on, I was looking for a way to fit in, and I really didn't have an idea for a winery. I just knew that I wanted to make wine. And so for a period of time early on at Revolution, I wasn't the winemaker. And so I was treading a bit lightly and just trying to fit in somewhere. And actually the first commercial wine I made was a port style wine, because my business partner then, they were missing a sweet wine in their lineup, and he thought it would be important to have a sweeter wine. And his winemaker at the time was not interested in doing that. And so I told him that I would do it for him. Or maybe he asked me. I don't remember. But anyway, so I found there's a guy, Ron Silva, been around for a little while in Lodi, in the Alta Mesa sub AVA. And being a Silva, he's He's very serious about his heritage and Portuguese varieties, and so he has a ton of different Portuguese varieties planted. And so I thought if we were going to make a port-style wine, right down the road from us, we have all 6 of the so-called noble Portuguese varieties for making that wine. And so we sourced that, and I was able to finagle a couple of the other varieties out that he wasn't going to give us. And that was fermented natively as well. So I was foot treading it, and one of the bins we were bin fermenting it, and one of them started to go on its own quite vigorously. And I would just hop from bin to bin foot treading. And so I inoculated all the other varieties with that.
Yeah.
And so that also was kind of like one of my first aha moments for native fermentations. That's a little bit of a segue from your current question. But anyway, so that was the impetus for that. I do like port. I don't drink a lot of it, but I just figured if we're going to make one, we should give it our best effort.
Yeah.
And we used some aged brandy as well. We didn't use grain alcohol or anything like that. We sought out, nicer brandies to make this stuff. And, we opened a bottle not too long ago of the 08, and it's pretty tasty. So that's how I got started with that. And I just figured that was how I was going to continue in that role, as I would just keep working with Portuguese varieties from Ron's vineyard. And then things just took a turn after I took over as winemaker. Then I didn't quite have enough time at first to entertain side projects. And then by the time I did get back to that, I realized that it's really white wines that I'm interested in. So if I'm going to start a project of my own in earnest, it's going to be what I like to drink.
Mm-hmm.
So
Hella
Shannon, yeah.
Nice. How'd that come about?
Hella Shannon actually was coined by Tegan Pasalacqua in 13 or 14. When we met, he put together a group and he's great at doing this kind of stuff, just like getting people together. So he just gathered friends and acquaintances, and then even strangers who make Shannon in Northern California, just so that we could all have an afternoon or an evening tasting each other's wines and talking about the wines and, sharing with each other and having a meal. And so at our first meeting, I think it was 2013, we were at Angel in Napa eating oysters.
Nice.
And I think Tegan just somehow blurted out, Hella Shannon. And that's where it started. I just took off with it. So people think that I created it, but it's really a Tegan Pasalacqua thing. But I don't know.
Sounds like something made by a couple Northern California
it's
guys
good.
either way.
It's silly, but
yeah. You make 6 different Shannons every year, 6, 7?
It depends. We make at least 4.
Okay.
Sometimes 7. Yeah.
What do you look for in a Shannon vineyard?
I can't say I necessarily look for anything in particular. I'll try anything. I'll try anything once. So if we find a new source for Shannon, I will usually try it, especially if there's some vine age. If there's some history to it, then I'm game, to just try it. And there's only been one vineyard that we've tried once and said, no, thank you to. All the others bring something to the table, express their Shannonness in a different way. So I actually welcome just Shannon in all kinds of different microclimates and terroirs, and I just want to see. I'm just interested in what kind of Chenin Blanc wines we can make in Northern California.
Do you have much say in any of the farming of the vineyards?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I will say, though, that we primarily work with folks who will work with us. So there usually isn't a whole lot of, I don't need to be too heavy-handed when I'm dealing with people But, like some of the vineyards we lease, most of the vineyards we source from. Some of the vineyards are totally hands off where we have no say whatsoever in the farming practices. We just get what we get. That's the case of our SRV Chenin. I will say, though, that handwork is still done. I mean, they use machines to hedge and to plow, to disc and undervine management, but they still handwork it. And this is like a 60-acre vineyard. They still prune it by hand. High water table, not terribly interesting soils, not necessarily farmed for the highest quality, but we love the wine that we can make from that spot.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one example. Another example, there are other people who are just much more fastidious and take the farming much more seriously, and will do anything that we ask. One vineyard that we lease in particular, we go and do a lot of the work ourselves. We used to harvest it ourselves too. It's just that we grafted some Chenin there a couple of years ago, and now it's too much for us to handle on our own. So we do pay pickers to go in there and do that. But we sucker it, we prune it, we shoot position it. We talk about weed. We talk about the weeds. We talk, So yeah, it runs the gamut from we're practically doing all the farming to we never touch a vine and everything in between.
You're mostly working organically and with organically farmed fruit?
Yeah. The one vineyard, the Sutter Ranch vineyard, is the one that is, it's Lodi sustainable, Lodi rules.
Okay.
Different people have different opinions about that. Some people call it greenwashing. Other people call it a step in the right direction. And I'll just leave it there. It's great fruit we get at. It's great fruit that we get at.
Yeah. You work a lot in that Clarksburg area with Chenin.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people have the picture in their head, Sonoma, Napa. How would you describe Clarksburg to someone? Because it's an interesting place, and you're in the Delta there and levees. And
the Delta is a magical spot. I don't know how it necessarily translates into finished wine, but it is a unique California wine growing region. Water table is high. Soils are loamy and rich. It has all the hallmarks of like making flabby, uninteresting, mass-produced wines. That definitely does occur. However, some of the best Chenin in California, I think, lives there. Earlier, we tasted the Wente clone Chenin that we discovered is right smack in the middle of the Clarksburg AV8. Mind you, the water table isn't quite as high there, and maybe they farm a little bit more for quality. But Wente clone Chenin that's been cleaned up by Wente and just makes a spectacular wine. And I don't think you can really argue with the results. So that's a gem. And there are other gems sprinkled around in the Delta, but by and large, it's a pretty quiet spot. But there's something really fascinating about it. I think I just love driving around on all the levee roads, and sometimes when we have people from out of the country who want to learn about Clarksburg, I try to fit in a ferry boat ride, bridge crossings, blow through some of the little towns and
the Rio Vista trip.
We'll stop off at Al's place or something at one of these shitty little bars and have a drink. And I mean, it's a very charming, picturesque, peaceful spot, and we can make good wines from these spots too if you take your job seriously. I mean, basically everything's dry farmed there. I mean, there are people who irrigate, but the water table is so high, it's kind of silly to even bring up dry farming.
Yeah, a lot of that you'd basically be underwater if it wasn't for the levees.
Yeah, some of these spots are like at sea level or below sea level. There's some history there. I will say though that Clarksburg is, I guess, known for Chenin Blanc, but I would say that the reason for its success is not so much what people say it is. Like typically when you read about Clarksburg and Shannon, people talk about how back in the day it was important because it was the squeeze of lime in the white wine cocktail, so it added the acid.
Okay.
So if you needed to make a blend and you needed to perk it up a bit, you could always count on Chenin Blanc. And although that's a good story, after working with this fruit for almost 20 years, I think it misses the mark a little bit. So not to put too fine a point on it, I think that Chenin was important to Clarksburg in the past, not so much because of its acidity, but just for its ability to blend well. Because the pHs and the TAs are, the acid is much lower in Clarksburg Chenin than, or any grape that I've experienced, than grown in other regions. So although the gist of the conversation, the main thrust of the conversation I agree with, I just don't think that it's about the acid. I think it's more about Chenin's ability to blend in and make a cuvee more interesting.
And that pH and acid, that's what you base most of your picking decisions on?
Yeah. We consider sugar, of course, but, we look at the fruit. Some vineyards, the pristine, green, high acid stuff is what we want. And for other vineyards, it's the more golden, speckled, maybe a little botrytis, that kind of thing we look for as well. But yeah, we basically pick on pH more so than other things. So as long as the fruit tastes good and the seeds are brown and there's separation of pulp and the pH is good, then we don't care so much about the sugars. Because I've made Chenin picked at 17 bricks. I've made Chenin picked at 25 bricks. And, they express themselves differently, but the 17 bricks Chenin is hardly green or underripe.
Mm-hmm.
There's still varietal character and some richness to it. So it's in my opinion, it's very hard to pick underripe in this part of California.
Mm-hmm. And then once you have that fruit in the winery, you're just lightly crushing or foot treading, and then mostly native fermentations?
Yep. It's all native fermentation. We don't correct chemistry. We don't add yeast. We don't add bacteria. All the wines are ML complete, and we don't inoculate for malolactic either. The spot we're in now has been a winery for over 50 years, and we've discovered that whatever lives in here is largely beneficial and definitely vigorous. Pretty much all of our wines are done with malolactic fermentation by Thanksgiving.
Quick.
Yeah.
It's nice. Put them to bed.
Yeah. Things happen fast here in this part of the world.
So you make a lot of white wines. Can you tell me a little bit about some of the reds you make?
Yeah, the reds, we kind of started off focused on Zinfandel, mainly because I think that's just what's historically more important for this region, is probably the reason why I've latched onto it, is there are older plantings of it, interesting sites. Those possibilities have always excited me. More recently, I'm less interested in Zinfandel because I've been trying to coax something out of California Zin that maybe shouldn't be. I mean, there are a lot of customers, and we do well with our lower alcohol, lighter expressions of Zinfandel, but it's tricky. It's very tricky. You can have the aromatics, but not the body. You can have the acid, but not the tannin. You can have Zinfandel is tricky. So we've more and more the past 5 years or so been looking at working with other varieties. And I think that what we've decided is that there's some Italian varieties that maybe do very well here, that are more to my liking. And that's pretty much what this project is about. It's like I don't have time to make wine that I don't enjoy drinking. So
You're working more and more with Nebbiolo.
Yeah, more and more
right?
with Nebbiolo. We have 3 Nebbiolo sources now, and I'm looking for some other Italian varieties as well. We have some Granulino that we might have access to soon. What else? A couple other varieties that are in the works maybe. I'd like to see somebody plant Caracante here. That would be interesting.
Hmm.
But for red varieties, Italian, it's like we talk a good game about Barbera in the foothills, but I think that there's still a lot of work to be done with that, and I'm interested in trying that myself. So yeah, we're a little bit less focused on Zinfandel now. Somehow we ended up with like 6 different Zinfandel sources, and I realized one day that we're pretty much all blending them together, and that those wines I just didn't take home with me as much. And I thought, Nebbiolo landed in our laps, and I love the Nebbiolo from Clarksburg. It's inexplicable to me how this wine is so delicious, because it's pretty much the opposite of how it's grown traditionally in Italy. But it just makes a wine that I love to drink. And so that's pretty much the impetus for me looking for more Nebbiolo in California and other Italian Piemontese grapes of origin from the Piemonte.
How are the reds treated once you get them into the winery?
The reds, typically we ferment on stems. It comes into the winery. In the case of the Nebbiolo, we don't really do any work to it. It shows up. We dump the clusters into open top 1-ton fermenters. We seal it up. We'll toss a little bit of dry ice in there, maybe to blanket it, keep the oxygen away for a bit until it can get going. And then we'll tread it when it starts to ferment. And that's basically it. The others, we will similarly just go straight from picking bin right into fermenters, and we'll give them a rigorous foot treading to juice it up and get things going. But that's pretty much our protocol for making red wine. Is it's all whole cluster, and we just let it do its thing. Oh,
Yeah.
also it's pump overs. We do pump overs until it gets really juicy. And then we'll maybe punch it down more towards the end, and then we tend to press a little bit early. Yeah, but it's pretty simple, straightforward, low tech winemaking
Mm-hmm.
for the reds.
What's the phrase Sacramento terroir mean to you?
Sacramento terroir is a phrase I coined when I was working at Revolution, mainly just to get people in the area and even outside the area, I suppose, thinking that Sacramento isn't just tomatoes and the Sacramento Kings and bureaucracy. There are other things here. It is a government town, which culturally I think holds us back a little bit, but there are great restaurants and wine bars, et cetera, et cetera. But basically, I coined that phrase just as a marketing thing to get largely Sacramentans thinking about Sacramento as a wine region, because some of us, who grew up in Sacramento, and maybe some of us who didn't, remember back in the day, the nickname for Sacramento was Sacra Tomato, or sack of tomatoes. And that's what I grew up with. And that was because, that's what we produced here. Sacramento County is big. It goes way down into the Delta. There's a lot of farmland in Sacramento. And we were known for producing tomatoes. And until recently, there were huge canning operations around town. That's just what we were known for. But then maybe 25 years ago, the wine grape surpassed in tonnage. I don't know if it's tonnage or dollars, but the wine grape surpassed the tomato in Sacramento County as the number one crop. And so I just thought this is important for people to know, because when people think about California and winemaking, They think that Sacramento is in this dead zone, that anything that's good is just outside of Sacramento, you know? And so having grown up in this dead zone, I don't have nearly the investment that some people seem to have in the Sacramento brand. But, I did grow up here, and my dad was from Chicago, and he always used to tell me, son, this town is so great because it's close to everything. And I remember when I was about 8 or 9 years old, I told him, so that means there's nothing here? And he didn't like that, but he's not from here. And so I'm sure he understood that that's the truth. Nothing comes from here other than legislation and I don't know, and tomatoes, I guess. But Sacramento is pretty much right in the middle of wine country. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a neighborhood in Sacramento called Vineyard because that's all there was out there was vineyards. And actually, there was a winery in downtown Sacramento called the California Wine Company that was the largest winery on the West Coast for a period of time.
Okay. Pre-prohibition?
Pre-prohibition, yeah. So, and it was always in the developed areas where the wineries were. So it was Sacramento, San Francisco, Southern California is where all the wineries were. And prohibition killed that. And I don't know. Sacramento terroir is not necessarily a flavor profile or a farming ethos. It's just more of a way to get people around here and elsewhere thinking about how there's more here in Sacramento than burgers and bacon and basketball and those other B words.
Yeah. Haarmeyer is a true family winery. Kind of all the members of your
Correct.
immediate family are involved in it, right?
Yep. Some more so than others. So my son is 32, and he has pretty much only worked in wine cellars. So that's pretty much all he knows. And in 2016, when we were restarting, he and I agreed together that we were going to do this together. This is what he wanted. So my hope is that this winery will keep living on with his efforts later on. So that's kind of how I feel like we're building this winery, so that not just so that I can pursue my interests in making Chenin, but also so that my son can have a business to operate later on down the road. And my daughter, my wife is part of the equation. She does wine club stuff and tech stuff. She builds our website. We're always talking. She's a big part of like driving the ship. And then my daughter graduated from UC Davis a couple of years ago with a degree in sustainable agriculture. And so she doesn't know it yet, but she's going to be the Haarmeyer Wine Cellars winemaker one day.
How do you feel like your wine making process has changed since you started, if it has?
It ebbs and flows. I learn as I go, and I learn some hard lessons, and I avoid some problems because I know enough to do that. Then I also make mistakes and learn from it. I would say that our winemaking process is changing in such a way that we're paying more attention to the pressures of climate change, and that includes disease pressures, lack of water, changing threats from pests. Basically, climate change is something to be reckoned with more and more. And here, since we're not on the coast, I feel like it's warmer here, and so the temperature can be a challenge. And so, in many parts of the world, warmer winemaking regions gravitate towards wines with higher alcohol, basically just to keep them protected. But lo and behold, we're people who want to make wines that we like to consume, which are lighter, lower alcohol wines, which presents a challenge, I feel, presents a challenge to us. So We definitely need to pay much more attention to the temperature in the cellar when we're making the wine. We also need to pay more attention in the vineyard, look out for potential threats of frost, dealing with wildfires and smoke taint. That usually is going to mean less skin contact, more fermenting juice than working with skins and stems and all that stuff that we do a lot with red wines, especially. So there are changes coming, but I feel like our winemaking is changing more just as a reaction to the challenges of climate change.
Mm-hmm. Like you said earlier, this building's been a winery for 50 years. Charlie and Harbor in it for a lot of that. Can you tell me a little bit about the history of Harbor?
Sure. So some of it I'm a little hazy on, but Charles Myers, a guy in town, he taught English at City College the entire time he operated the winery, as a matter of fact. And his office mate was Daryl Cordy's partner. So, and I don't know what happened first, but that relationship was cemented. And my understanding is that Daryl Cordy kind of pushed Charles into commercial winemaking, probably because Mr. Cordy thought that the wines that he was making were exceptional and that he should pursue it in a bigger way. So Charles started making wine here at 610 Harbor Boulevard in Sacramento, West Sacramento, in 1968, as far as I know. And he had access to a couple small rooms here. The building was largely used for a shop that worked on old cars and did upholstery for old cars. And then a couple of years later, they shut down, and that's when Charles bought the building, which I think was 71 or 72. At that point, he had it bonded, and it was then officially a winery. And I know the family from many different directions. His wife at the time was one of my mother's best friends, so we were connected to the winery in that way. Also, Charles's daughter, Margaret, went to McClatchy High School here, and her best friend ended up being one of my mother's other best friend's daughter, and that family they're my godparents, so we know them from that direction. And then also later on, I met an artist friend. I went to school with a photographer friend, and he was good friends with Margaret's husband, Tony Passarell, who is the jazz musician here. You see his equipment up there in the loft. So I've known the family from many different directions, but it pretty much started in 1968, and then in 1972 became a commercial winery. They used to hang out with all the people in the day. Alice Waters would come to town to talk to Daryl, and so Alice Waters came through here and tasted, and she always had some harbor winery on the wine list.
That's great.
Joe Heights, I'm told, would stop off here once in a while and hang out, and taste barrels. They'd have harvest parties, and that was actually my first experience here. It was during harvest at one of the harvest parties. So there's a bit of history here. Yeah, it's basically Daryl Cordy's friends and associates that would come to town to visit him. He would many times send them this way.
Yeah, and you saw some of the old
old
equipment.
Yeah, old
hanging
dairy
around.
tanks. We have these old dairy tanks here that Charles used, and we used those for the first couple of years we were here. We used his press. He has an old Voslin screw press from 1972 that we used for our first 3 vintages, which is very helpful because when we restarted, we had no money. Or we didn't have no money. We had $10,000, but most of that went to my attorneys to form the business entity and get all the licensing done. And then the last couple $1,000 we bought bottles and corks and labels. So we really didn't have a whole lot of equipment. As a matter of fact, the first vintage here, my son and I, we processed 23 tons, and that was all hand bucketed. We had
wow.
we had no forklift, no pump. It was totally just large scale home winemaking.
Yeah.
in 2016. Yeah.
That's real large scale.
Yeah.
It's not picking a couple Home Depot buckets of grapes.
Yep. But it worked.
Yeah. Tell me what the best way for people to get your wines or follow what the winery's up to are?
We rely heavily on Instagram. So you can follow us on Instagram, Haarmeyer Wine Cellars, or you can follow me personally. Most of my personal postings are all wine related, food related. That's at Craig Haarmeyer, haarmeyer.com. You can go there and purchase wines online that we ship to several states. Join our mailing list at that point. We have a wine club finally. And then out in the real world, you can find our wines on both coasts, usually small wine shops and certain restaurants around town. But in this locale, Cordy Brothers, Taylor's Market, we're at several restaurants in the Bay Area. Vintage Berkeley is a big supporter. Big Grape is a big supporter of us. Terroir used to be. Unfortunately, they're no more. But yeah, you can usually find us around town in wine shops, smaller wine shops and such. Buy some wine. Buy what you like and buy some wine. Not necessarily ours, but drink some different stuff. Spend a few minutes talking to whoever you're having dinner with or sipping with. Take a few minutes to just describe what you're tasting, and then get on to enjoyment. But seek out some interesting stuff and make wine an important part of every meal.
Thanks for listening to episode 5 with Craig. His Chenin really expresses the sites it's grown so well, with vivid differences despite being treated very similar in the cellar, and the reds are fresh and bright with little or no oak influence. You can follow the podcast on wherever you're listening, and also the Instagram at Indie Wine Podcast for updates, or email indiewinepodcast@gmail.com. The next episode will be an interview with Mike Dunn, the longtime wine writer for the Sac Bee and other publications. We'll be talking about his recently released book, The Signature Wines of Superior California, and dive in deeper about changes he's seen over the years and the areas covered by the book, and what some of these wines and wineries mean to him. Thanks again. Have a good one.